My own son slid a stack of papers across my kitchen table and tapped the last page with one finger. He said, "Dad, just sign right here. It's only the refinance." Except, it was not a refinance. It was a deed. One signature would have handed over the house I spent 30 years paying off, the house his mother died in, the house he learned to walk in. He sat there smiling at me the whole time he did it. What my son did not know was that I had already read every word of those papers 3 days earlier. So had a lawyer. And the quiet woman drinking coffee at the end of my table was not an old friend of his mother's. This is the story of how my own boy tried to take my home out from under me, and exactly what that mistake cost him. My name is Gene Kowalski. I am 68 years old, and I live in Parma, Ohio, in the same brick house I have lived in for more than 30 years. Before I tell you what happened at that kitchen table, I want to be honest about one thing. Some of the doors my son walked through were doors I held open for him myself, and it took me a long time to admit that. If stories like this one mean something to you, take 1 second and hit subscribe, because it genuinely helps. Now let me back up to where all of it really started. I spent 42 years as a union electrician in Cleveland. I crawled through attics in July and basements in January, and I wired hospitals and schools and half the strip malls between here and Akron. It was hard work and honest work, and it taught me one lesson I repeated to every apprentice who ever carried my ladder. You never trust a wire until you have tested it yourself, because the wires that kill you are the ones somebody swore were dead. I tested every wire I ever touched. That habit is the only reason I am here telling you this story, instead of lying in the ground next to a few men I knew who skipped that step. My wife Margie and I bought our house when our son Derek was 2 years old. We paid it off the year I retired, and I can still see Margie standing in the driveway, holding that mortgage paper over a coffee can of matches like it was a trophy. When Margie got sick, really sick, I wired an old intercom between the kitchen and the garage so she could reach me without shouting. I spent half my days out there fixing things just to keep my hands busy. She used to press that button and say, "Gene, quit hiding with your tools and come drink coffee with me." She passed 3 years ago this spring. Between her life insurance and my pension and a paid-off house, I was comfortable. Not rich, but comfortable in the way a working man dreams about his whole life. Derek came around a lot after the funeral, and I was grateful for it. I told myself my boy was finally growing into the man his mother always believed he would be. Looking back, I gave him credit he had not earned yet, and I handed him keys, in more ways than one, that I should have kept in my own pocket. The first sign came about 6 months after the funeral, and I missed it completely. We were having dinner for what would have been Margie's birthday, and my daughter-in-law Ashley asked me, right over the pot roast, whether the insurance had paid out yet, and how much it came to. I remember my fork stopping halfway to my mouth. Derek laughed it off and said she was just worried about me being taken care of, and I wanted to believe that, so I did. A man who has just lost his wife will believe almost anything that sounds like love. A few months after that, Derek started coming by on Sundays to help me with the paperwork, the bills, the property taxes, the pension statements. He works as a mortgage broker, and he has always been good with documents in a way I never was. Because my whole life, the only paperwork I trusted was a wiring diagram. He suggested we put his name on my checking account, just for convenience, he said, just in case something ever happened to me. I told him I would think about it, and something small and quiet in my chest told me not to, and for once I listened to it. But I still let him keep copies of everything. I still let him see exactly what I had. Then came the stretch I now think of as the softening up. At Thanksgiving, Derek told the whole table a story about me leaving a burner going on the stove, except the way he told it, I had nearly burned the house down, when the truth was, I stepped away from a pot of soup for 5 minutes to answer the door. Ashley started mailing me brochures for a place called Golden Meadows, glossy pictures of old men playing cards, with little notes that said, "Just something to think about, Dad." My granddaughter Sophie, who was 9 that year, asked me one Saturday why Daddy kept saying Grandpa was getting confused. I told her Grandpa was fine, and she nodded. But she watched me the rest of that afternoon the way you watch something you have been told is broken. That one stung worse than all the rest of it combined. And then right after the new year, Derek sat me down at my own kitchen table with a legal pad and gave me the speech he had clearly been practicing. He said, "Dad, if you ever end up in a nursing home, the state will take the house. They will take everything. It happened to a client of mine." He said, the smart move, the loving move, was to sign the house over to him and Ashley now, so it would be protected, so it would stay in the family. He said the word family the way a salesman says the word deal. I told him I would think about it, and he smiled and squeezed my shoulder and said, "That's all I ask." What I did not tell him was that the whole drive to church that Sunday, my hands would not settle on the wheel, and I could not figure out why. I found out why on an ordinary Saturday in February, and it came through a wire I had soldered myself. Sophie was over for the afternoon, and the little box fan she keeps in her room had quit, so the two of us carried it out to the garage to open it up, because I believe a kid should see how things work before somebody tells her they are too complicated. Halfway through, Sophie ran inside to use the bathroom, and I stayed at the bench cleaning the motor. That old intercom, the one I wired for Margie, still hangs on the garage wall, and I keep it switched on out of habit, or maybe out of something more tender than habit. The kitchen unit sits by the coffee maker, and Ashley was standing right next to it, on her phone with her sister, with no idea it was live. Her voice came through that little speaker as clear as a radio station. She said the house would list around 340,000, easy, maybe more the way the neighborhood was going. She said Derek was drawing up the paperwork himself through his office, and that they would walk me through it as a refinance, because, and I am quoting my daughter-in-law word for word here, the old man won't know a quitclaim from a coupon. She said once the house sold, they could finally clear the credit cards and the boat loan, and Golden Meadows had beds open, and it was basically assisted living anyway, and I would adjust. I stood there in my own garage holding a screwdriver, listening to my future being divided up over my dead wife's intercom. I did not shout. I did not march inside. I picked up the pencil on my workbench, opened the little spiral job log I have kept every working day for 42 years, and wrote down the date, the time, and every word I could remember, the same way I used to log a bad circuit. Because in that moment, one thought arrived and sat down in my chest like a stone. I had spent my whole life testing wires, and I had never once thought to test my own son. Sophie came skipping back out to the garage, and I smiled at her and handed her the screwdriver, and we finished her fan like nothing had happened. But something had happened, and by Monday morning, I was sitting in a lawyer's office. The lawyer's name was Carmen Ruiz, and she came recommended by an old friend from my union hall whose mother she had helped through something similar. Her office was small and plain, over a bakery on Ridge Road, and I liked her before she said 10 words, because she listened the way good foremen listen, with a pad and a pen, and no interruptions. When I finished, she asked me one question. She said, "Gene, do you want to punish your son, or do you want to protect your house?" I told her the truth. I said I wanted both, and I was ashamed of half of that answer. She nodded like she had heard it 100 times, and then she took apart Derek's nursing home speech piece by piece. She told me the fear he was selling had a grain of truth in it, because long-term care really can eat a family's savings, and the state really does look back 5 years at anything you give away. But she said signing my house over to my son was just about the worst way on earth to handle that fear, because the moment my name came off that deed, I would be a guest in my own home, a guest of Derek, a guest of Ashley, a guest of their credit cards and their boat loan. Then she told me what we were going to do instead, and it was so simple I almost laughed. We would set up a living trust, and we would move the house into it that same week. The trust would own the house. I would run the trust. And here is the part I want you to hear clearly, because it is the part that mattered. Once that house sat inside the trust, my signature as plain old Gene Kowalski could not give it away anymore, no matter what anybody slid across my kitchen table. Any deed Derek printed would be worth less than the paper in Sophie's coloring books. Carmen also asked me, gently, whether I wanted to update my will while we were at it, and I sat with that question for a long minute. Then I told her yes. Derek's share would go into the trust for Sophie, held until she turned 25, and I signed that page without my hand shaking even once. The last thing Carmen said to me that day was the thing I had been wrestling with all weekend. I asked her why I should not just confront him, right now, father to son, she said, because he will cry, and he will apologize, and he will wait, and he will try again in 5 years when you are 80 and tired, and next time you might not have a garage intercom. She said, if you want this to end, let him walk all the way out onto the wire. Let him show you, in front of witnesses, exactly what he is. So that is what I did. When Derek called 2 weeks later and said the refinance paperwork was ready and that he would bring a notary to the house on Saturday morning to make it official, I said that sounded fine. Then I hung up the phone, poured myself a cup of coffee, and called Carmen. I asked her if she was free on Saturday. She said she would bring the Danish. Saturday morning, my kitchen smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner, because some habits of Margie's are mine now. Derek showed up at 10 with Ashley and a young notary named Kyle Brennan, a nervous kid from his office with a stamp and a briefcase. I introduced Carmen as a dear friend of Margie's from the old neighborhood, and Ashley barely looked at her twice, because to Ashley, a gray-haired woman in a cardigan was furniture. The four of them settled around my table, and Derek laid out the papers in 3 neat piles, tabbed with little yellow arrows pointing at every place I was supposed to sign. He was good. I will give him that. He walked me through it slow and warm, like I was a customer he liked, and he kept saying the word refinance the way you keep a hand on a dog you do not trust. I picked up the pen he handed me. I let the room get quiet, and then I set the pen down on the table, and I asked Kyle the notary one simple favor. I said, son, before I sign, would you read the title of that first document out loud for me? My eyes are not what they were. Kyle glanced at Derek, then down at the page, and read the words quitclaim deed into my quiet kitchen. You could have heard a fuse blow 3 houses away. Ashley's coffee cup stopped in the air. Derek said, Dad, it's a standard part of the refinance package, and his voice went up at the end like a boy caught by a teacher. So I reached into the drawer behind me and set 2 things on the table. The first was my spiral job log, open to a page in February, with a date, a time, and every word Ashley said on that phone call written in carpenter's pencil, including the part about the old man not knowing a quitclaim from a coupon. The second was a copy of the trust. I told them the house they were dividing up had not belonged to plain old Gene Kowalski for 2 weeks. It belonged to the Margaret Kowalski family trust, and no signature at this table could move it 1 inch. Then Carmen took a business card out of her cardigan, slid it across to Kyle, and introduced herself properly as my attorney. That poor kid packed his stamp so fast he knocked over his chair, because a notary who seals a fraud can lose everything, and he knew it. Ashley turned on Derek right there in front of me and hissed, "You said he would never read it." And Derek, my son, my only child, looked at me with his mother's eyes and said the one honest thing he had said in a year. He said, "Dad, we are drowning." I told him I knew. The boat, the cards, all of it, and that I would have helped him if he had ever once asked me straight. Then I told him the only reason I was not mailing my job log to the licensing board that handles mortgage brokers was sitting at a school desk right that minute, learning long division, and her name was Sophie. I wanted my signature, he had said, so I gave him one. I signed the bottom of a photocopy of the trust, dated it, and handed it to him, and I said, "There you go, son. That is the last thing I ever signed for you." They left my house that morning without the deed and without the coffee cake Ashley had brought, which sat on my counter for 3 days until I finally fed it to the birds. There were no police, and there was no lawsuit, because Carmen and I agreed the punishment should fit the crime, and the crime, in the end, was attempted. What Derek lost was exactly what he had tried to take from someone else. He lost his claim on my house, because his inheritance now sits in a trust with his daughter's name on it, waiting for her 25th birthday. He lost the story he had been telling the family about his confused old father, because word travels fast among the cousins, and nobody mails me brochures anymore. And for a long while, he lost the right to sit at my kitchen table, which I suspect hurt him more than the money once the dust settled. Ashley never apologized. Derek did, about 6 months later, in a letter with no excuses in it, and I have read that letter more times than I will admit to you. We are not healed. I want to be honest about that, because these stories always seem to end in a hug, and real life is slower than that. But we are speaking, a little, on the porch, where the ground is neutral. Sophie, though. Sophie is at my house every single Saturday, and that was my one condition. And to Derek's credit, he has never once been late dropping her off. She and I fix things in the garage, radios, lamps, a neighbor's mower, and last month I taught her how to use a voltage tester, and I told her what I told every apprentice for 42 years. You never trust a wire until you have tested it yourself. She looked up at me and asked, "Grandpa, did you ever test a wire and find out it was good?" And I had to turn toward the workbench for a second before I could answer her, because the truth is, I tested my whole family the hardest way there is. And one wire came back strong and bright and humming with life, and she was standing right next to me holding my old tester. Margie's intercom still hangs on the garage wall, and I still leave it switched on. It saved this house once. I figure it has earned its spot. So now I will ask you what I ask myself on the quiet nights. Have you ever had to test the people closest to you, and were you ready for the answer? Tell me your story in the comments, and tell me where you are listening from, because I read every one. And if this story reminded you to look a little closer at your own paperwork, share it with somebody you love, and subscribe for more true stories like mine.